Welcome everyone to the Data Science Hangout. I know a lot of you have been here before, but if this is your first time, it is an open space for current and aspiring data science leaders, really to just connect and chat about some of the more human-centric questions around data science leadership. And so we really want to create a space where everybody can participate and hear from everyone from the community. So there's 3 ways that you could ask questions. You could jump in live, put questions in the chat, and we also have a Slido link that Rob will share shortly. But you could ask anonymous questions there too. And just a quick note for everyone that it is recorded, so it'll be shared up to YouTube as well for anybody who's missed it. But I am so excited to introduce my co-hosts for today's Hangout. Merav, who is co-founder and CEO of Data Society. And Merav, I'd love to have you also just introduce yourself and share a little bit about the work you do in Data Society.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you so much for having me. I love doing these types of events, so it's so great to see y'all. If you have a camera, you feel like turning it on, I love to see people. If not, that's fine too. I understand people might be running around with kids in the background and or eating lunch. So that's absolutely acceptable. As Rachel said, my name is Merav Yuravlivker, CEO and co-founder of Data Society. Just to give you a bit of a background as to who I am, I'm a teacher first and foremost. I actually started my career in the classroom way back in the day in New York City public schools and spent several years in the education space before starting Data Society. And the reason why we started it is because we saw that there were a lot of professionals in the space who needed to understand how to use data, but didn't have $40,000 to get a master's degree, didn't have hundreds of hours to spend looking through YouTube videos. And we saw an opportunity to build practical, customized training programs to deliver specifically to federal agencies as well as Fortune 500 companies to really help people get up to speed quickly. Because what we believe, and I'm sure what a lot of you do as well, is that when you layer a data skill set on top of the industry knowledge that many people already have, you are really transforming the way that people work and the way that industries run. And our goal is to help industries and companies become more data driven, because we think that's what's going to lead to the greatest innovative leaps. And it gives us the most power to be able to solve a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in today's space. So we're really passionate about helping people understand how to use data. We also have our consulting side. Frankly, it just came out of teaching. When you teach what you do, a lot of people ask you to do what you teach. So we build custom software, predictive algorithms, help with digital transformation, and we do a lot on that side of it as well. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we have offices in Richmond, and we have folks all over the country, especially as we've gone remote during the pandemic. So that's a little bit about me and who I am and what I do.
Thank you, Merav. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in from the audience, I'm just curious, what does that process look like when you start with a new client and are starting off that whole training process?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're very much focused on solutions and outcomes. So for us, every single client that we have has a bit of a consultative approach at first. We talk about what are learning objectives, what are people's current skill sets. We also deliver assessments that can help people actually understand what skill sets are. So we go through that, and then we develop customized pathways based on those objectives and the starting points. And we have an in-house team of data scientists as well as instructional designers that work together to make sure that all the content that we deliver is best of breed. We work with a lot of instructors who have industry experience. We have in-house instructors as well. And our main goal is really to create a good experience where people can walk away and actually immediately start to use the skills that they have. So a lot of our programs also have capstone projects, which are a really great way to demonstrate return on investment and also application of data skills directly to a challenge that they're facing. There's actually one other piece that I didn't mention, which is as we expanded our technical training, what we saw is that there's a bigger gap that we're trying to bridge right now, which is the communication gap between data and non-data professionals. We've seen that's a really big pain point in a lot of organizations. So we actually have our whole non-technical series that works with executives, managers, and general staff so that people can all speak the same language, because we want to facilitate that level of collaboration and communication across an organization.
That's awesome. I'm thinking that from the audience here, there's also a lot of people who are maybe doing this training internally at their organizations, or are like the one kind of spearheading that and getting people interested. So do you have any kind of tips or best practices for doing that?
Yes, first of all, congratulations. And that's a really hard job to have. So I'm always happy to help if you ever want to chat with me specifically about that. One of the biggest ways that we've seen that can facilitate interest in this type of training is to demonstrate the value that it has. So if you have data science teams who are using data analytics, or there's a particular project within your industry or your organization that was successful, shout it from the rooftops, get some lunch and learns, get that newsletter out, make sure that people are aware of the benefits that they can have if they start to implement these skills. And then the other piece of it is make sure that you have data champions in high places. What we've seen, especially to start with, is if you don't have a mandate from the top to become more data driven, I mean, most people just won't take the time out of their day to learn these skills because they don't feel like it's mandated. So it has to come from the top. You have to have folks saying, we need to make sure that we're using these metrics, that you understand what they mean. We need to be asking questions about where this data is coming from. We need to make sure that our data is kept securely. And having that type of conversation come from the top helps give cover to people in a way who want to take the time out of their day, but maybe weren't able to before because maybe their direct supervisor didn't see the value in it. So get a data champion that's high up there, and then make sure any successful data projects that you have are well publicized, are two tips that I would give.
Thank you. And feel free anyone to raise your hand too if you want to, or I can take people unmuting as raising their hand as well. But just to follow up on that, so finding that data champion higher up in the company, how should you actually go about doing that if you're part of a large organization?
Yeah, it's not always easy. That's what I'll say. Politics in large organizations can vary. Sometimes they're less difficult than others. I would say start with the allies you know you have. If there's one person, even if they're your colleague as opposed to somebody higher up, just get together, start talking about maybe building something like this, an event like this internally, right? Once a month, you just meet people who are interested in using data, start to get a quorum so that when you go to a supervisor or an executive, you can demonstrate the level of interest that your organization has. The other piece of it is bring in other examples of companies that might be more data driven than yours, because we all want to make sure we won't become obsolete. And what I've seen is that organizations now, if they are not going towards this whole holistic data literacy and building a data culture, if organizations aren't moving towards that, it's going to be very difficult for them to keep up with the market in the next 5 to 10 years. And when you say things like that to an executive audience, they tend to listen. So if you see that your competitors or other players in your industry are doing this, that's another good motivator, especially for those at the executive level.
Thank you. I see a follow-up anonymous question that came in on Slido. When you mentioned well publicized, what do you mean by making sure your work's well publicized?
So if there is a project that went well, I would look at what avenues you have available to you to just disseminate that information. I personally love lunch and learns, because just like this one, because it highlights a person who's doing a great job and also encourages knowledge sharing across an organization. If you have enough people who are participating, it tends to disseminate. So I would do that. If there are newsletters, I know we work with a very large client who said they get 20 newsletters a week. So sometimes it's not really the best avenue, but for a lot of folks, you also might have Slack, you might have Microsoft Teams. If you have any media outlets. I know that organizations love to show how data driven they are. So if you are in touch with your marketing team or your PR team, I mean, throw that at them. You know, that may be something they would want to do a little press release about, or potentially reach out to one of their contacts. So there are a few different ways to go about it, to try to garner that level of attention.
That's a great point. Frank, I see you asked a question in the chat if you want to ask that live.
Hi, Frank.
Hey, folks. Good to see everyone again. This is a really fascinating way to start the hour. You got me wondering, is there any tips that you have to try to find a balance between, hey, let's do this. We got in a huddle. We have this idea. We have this project. Let's see it through. And hopefully once we get it, we can put it in the newsletter, or we can put it out there on social media and show people that we're data driven. But man, we can't wait, right? You don't want to wait 3, 6, 12 months for that cycle to happen. Is there a way like that you work faster? I don't know, to experiment, to say like, oh yeah, this is the right direction, or no, let's pivot and be okay with pivoting and try something else.
That's a great question. The short answer is it depends on the project you want to focus on. So, and it also depends on the data that you have. So especially if you're starting from a point where you just want to get something off the ground, start with the data that you have, because data collection, I think as many of us know, can take 3, 6, 9 months, depending on the type of data that you have. So if you have data that you think can answer maybe 1 or 2 questions that you have that would be relevant to some of the challenges that your team is facing, your department, look for that low-hanging fruit. Because once you have the data, the cycle to actually go through cleaning can take a while. Hopefully your data's in good shape. But once you have that, it's pretty straightforward to run through any data visualizations if you want to build a dashboard, or alternatively, if you're running it through some machine learning algorithms. That whole prototyping process is pretty quick. And if you have, I would also start with a small amount of data just to see if you're on the right track. So take a subset of your data, train your model on that, then test it, and then see if it works out. And, if not, that's okay. That's all part of the process. It's hard to guarantee a good outcome when we're doing this type of work.
It's lovely. Yeah, you got me thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate. It's so hard for especially large organizations. Like, this is not a 1-month project. This is a multi-year project. So I always recommend, especially if you're just getting started, look for the low-hanging fruit. Like, where are the people in your company that would be big advocates for this? Where's the data that if even put into a visual interactive dashboard would garner that type of attention? That's where you want to start with. I love data visualization because it's usually presented in a way that most people understand, and it's less intimidating to executives who might not know how to use data. Everybody loves to look at a pretty picture and point to trends, right? That's a nice and easy way to get people on board.
Thank you, Merav. There was an anonymous question earlier that was, how do you measure the success of a data science project or client engagement? But also, how do you help companies define this?
So how do we do it as a company?
I think that's the question, but probably also how they could do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. The key to defining success is defining the metrics that you want to look at. And that's true of a data science project. It's true of any of the programs that we run, because at the end of the day, you could say, is a policy that we've developed successful? But if you don't know what metrics to measure, it's very hard to answer that question. So the first thing that we want to do, that we do, and that I would recommend for anyone when starting out with a data science project, is what's the key question you're trying to answer, and what are the metrics that you're going to use to answer that question? So for example, if you want to take a look at the effectiveness of a marketing campaign, for example, the question could be maybe how many people want to buy a certain product or clicked on a particular ad, and then what are the metrics that you're using? Well, you're probably using people who click on it, but maybe you also want to take the click-through rate. Maybe you'll see that out of 1,000 people that saw it, only 5 people clicked on the ad. Is that a successful rate for you? You would have to compare that against other baseline rates that you've done. If you've run another campaign that maybe had 100 clicks, then maybe that's not a successful campaign. But if this campaign is garnering clicks and another one didn't, then I would consider that a success as well. So you want to take the baseline measures, you want to make sure you're defining your metrics correctly, and you want to also make sure you're asking the right question. A lot of times asking the right question and then getting the right data, there's a bit of a back and forth there, because if you don't ask the right question at first, you might be collecting data and metrics that are not relevant. So what you want to do is just make sure that the metrics are well defined before starting any of those projects, and that will help define success through that.
Thank you. Hugh, I know you asked a question in the chat earlier, and I can see that Libby gave a +1 to that too. So I'd love to go over to that question next if you want to ask live.
Sure. Hey, my name's Hugh. I'm an analyst with the VA. I did want to start with, I love what you just said about picking important metrics. My background is like process improvement systems design, and that's a challenge. How do you figure out what customers value and then measure it? So I really like that. I like your comment about lunch and learns or forums like this. I host a monthly thing internally for VHA where we do something eerily similar. And one of the challenges that I face is, especially since COVID and it's all virtual, sometimes it feels like you're talking to this nameless, faceless room of people. Do you have any advice on kind of getting people to participate or chime in so that it's not this more of a monologue than, you know, me talking to talking instead of listening? Thank you.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and I'm so glad to hear that you're doing that event. I love to hear those types of examples. One way that we found to be really effective is to break out into small groups. So ask a discussing question, and then break people out into 4 to 5 people per group, and give the folks 5 to 7 minutes to discuss the question internally, and then have them come back and designate one person to actually tell you what they talked about. The reason why I recommend that is because in a large group like this, people are generally shy. They know they don't really have to participate, and maybe they just want to listen. But when you get folks into a smaller group environment, all of a sudden there's more pressure to appear on camera, to participate. So we've seen a lot of people open up this way. This is how we run a lot of our trainings, actually, now that we're doing live streaming. And we've even gotten comments from folks saying that it's more interactive than in person because they feel like they have to participate. So I would recommend starting off with like an icebreaker like that even, and then maybe peppering in some of those questions throughout any presentation that you do. Even if there's less interaction on the big group, I am almost positive you're going to see more interaction in the small groups, and you're going to see more development of relationships between colleagues, which I found to be one of the most beneficial aspects of any type of event like this.
That's awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So the breakouts will start in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, see y'all later. That's my way of not talking as much. That's my excuse. So,
Merav, there's another anonymous question that is, could you give some specific examples of projects that you've helped clients work through?
Absolutely. So I'll give one on the consulting side, and then I can give one on the training side as well, just so you see the variety of work that we do. We recently just finished doing a digital transformation project with a financial institution, small bank that had a lot of disparate data systems and didn't really understand where to start. They were also really worried about compliance and reporting to federal agencies like the FDIC, for example. So we ran a project with them where we did a lot of in-depth conversations with their leadership team, took a look at their IT systems, which were, and again, this is a nameless company, so not putting them on the spot. There were a lot of Excel spreadsheets, I'll just say that, which we like to refer to as dark data, which is data that remains on one person's laptop and is never, ever shared out to anyone else. So this is also just a call out. If you have a lot of Excel spreadsheets on your laptop, all other colleagues do, try to find a shared drive. Just keep that data somewhere centralized, because we found a lot of our insights come from when we put these types of disparate data sources together. And that's when you start to see patterns emerge that you wouldn't have otherwise. That's my little spiel about dark data. back to this, we ended up identifying a few ways for them to consolidate their own systems and delivered a final recommendations report in terms of how to implement that. And we're going to start implementation with them in the next few months. So that's an example of some of the work that we do on the consulting side, which is just helping people become better organized in terms of the data infrastructure side. For our training side of the house, we run typically programs on an annual basis. We'll run several cohorts throughout the year. One of the recent cohorts that we did was with the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB federal agency. We delivered 2 cohorts simultaneously across 60 individuals who were working with 20 different federal agencies. It was an 8-week program where we helped them refresh on data wrangling skills, as well as machine learning fundamentals, including clustering and classification techniques. And then we also supported them through their capstone projects that they then presented to their leadership at capstone presentations at the end. So 8-week program, 64 hours in total. And each agency presented their own capstone project to leadership at the end. And the results that we got out of that were pretty great, in my opinion, because what we were seeing is people collaborating together who had not necessarily met before and continuing that conversation even beyond the program. One of my favorite capstone presentations was actually done by the National Park Service. What they did is they combined weather data along with geographical data in terms of their national parks, as well as visitor data, to determine the top 10 parking lots where they would put in solar charging stations. So based on all of those metrics, they identified the top 10 parking lots that they will be putting in solar charging stations to actually start to collect revenue. And they estimate that once that is put in place, they'll be able to collect, $100,000 per year per parking lot. So just out of that project, we're looking at $1 million a year in a new revenue stream that they wouldn't have had before. So those are some of the examples of projects that we help students develop and can actually create real value right off the bat. So those are some examples that we have.
That's so cool. How did they go about just brainstorming those ideas?
A lot of it came from their mentors. So one of the reasons why I actually really like the OMB program is because they had mentors in each agency. So the students who participated met with the mentors and discussed what project they wanted to focus on. And so they got guidance from leadership in that regards.
Awesome. Edgar, I see you had asked a question earlier around, well, actually, it's a longer question, so I'm not going to try and summarize it if you want to jump in and ask that.
Yeah, it was more so a comment just to kind of dovetail on what was shared, that you got to learn where you're improving from. And most of the time, at least in our early beginnings, like 4 or 5 years ago, we were improving from gut feel. There wasn't really a baseline. And that's kind of where you want to start, is what is your project improving from? And if it's just basically improving from somebody's gut feel that something should be or shouldn't be done, the success of the project in and of itself is a repeatability of the analysis that is being done off of gut feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And, gut feeling is interesting to me because we get a lot of people who say, well, I've been in this industry for 20 to 30 years. I know what I'm doing. I don't need data to tell me what I'm doing. Yeah. And that's not necessarily something we ever want to dismiss, because listen, at the end of the day, computers are good at a lot of things, including repetitive tasks, but no machine understands concepts and context better than we do. But I like to point to this study that was done, gosh, it might be a decade ago now, where there was a group of researchers who surveyed 80 law professors. I can't remember if they're from Harvard or not, and asked them to predict the outcomes of cases based on the case file. And then they also developed an algorithm to predict the outcomes of cases as well. And in fact, the algorithm outperformed all of the experience of those law professors. Now, that doesn't mean we should throw out all the law professors and now only focus on algorithms, right? Obviously, there's a lot of nuance to all of this. But what it does mean is that we should always encourage folks to use data as a starting point, as a baseline, to make sure that their gut is headed in the right direction. I don't think that these types of algorithms will replace us anytime soon. But what I like to think of them doing is to augment the skills that we already have so that we can ensure that we're making the best decisions possible with the information that we have.
Yeah, definitely. For us, a big concern was, succession management too. We have people with like 10, 20, 30 years doing the same thing. How do you do knowledge transfer, especially with now newer generations that don't want to last as long in those jobs?
Yeah, that's another really great point. That's why I love, code repositories, so something like GitHub or Bitbucket, developing shared drives to host, to keep all of this data, to keep all of these algorithms and coding templates is crucial to ensure that you're not redoing things you have been before or losing information. So data governance, and we haven't really touched upon this, but data governance is a really important piece of that, just to set the standard of how data should be used, and then what the expectations are so that everyone's aligning on those rules.
Touching on gut and that gut feel and the person with 20 years experience, I think Kahneman on a podcast once said something along the lines of like he thinks the most important mental model of all the stuff that he's written about is base rates. Right? Like, what is the historical probability? So before we even get to algorithms and deep data analytics, right? How do you get your users just to start using that historical probability, right? Start at a point that is perhaps more grounded in truth, then layer on your gut.
That's right.
In the right direction.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I see, Robert, you asked a question you said I can read out loud. And I just want to say, if anybody maybe is in a busy room and doesn't want me to call on them to ask their question too, you can still put them in the chat, maybe put like a little star at the end and I'll know to read it. But Robert asks, how do you gain the trust of a new client after the engagement starts? In other words, how do you make them feel like your team is delivering value?
That's a great question. The key to that is communication and clarity. What I've found is building trust takes time, of course. And while we say that we have everybody's best interests at heart, I know that there are folks that have always had bad experiences with people like that, right? So it's not enough to say it, but we have to show it. So what does that mean? In terms of our training programs, we usually set up weekly check-ins, especially if it's a longer program. We ensure that we solicit feedback from students. So for some of our longer programs, we also have these very short check-ins. They're typically 2 questions. The first one is, how difficult did you find the material? So to help us ensure that we're meeting their expectations in terms of skill level. And the second one is, how relevant is this material to your work, to make sure that we're always teaching the most important topics. And we also have a section for any additional information. So we keep a pulse on how our students are feeling during the class. So if we see anything maybe out of the ordinary, we can address it right away. In terms of communication for our consulting projects, we operate very similarly in terms of that level of communication, ensuring we have those regular touch points, ensuring that our clients understand the progress that we're making, and then also making sure that when issues pop up, we bring them up, right? I think, sometimes clients are afraid to come with me with negative feedback, and I get it. Nobody likes to tell somebody anything unpleasant, but for me, I welcome it because that's the only way that we grow and that we get better. And if I don't know about it, then I won't be able to fix it. So whenever I have conversations like that, the first thing I always say is, hey, thank you for bringing this to me, right? That should be everybody's automatic reaction. And then the second piece of it is, let's talk about what we can do, what steps we can take to make sure that you are getting what you are expecting from us. So that level of communication and clarity tends to mitigate any issues that come about. And then just making sure if we see any issues on our side, if the data is not where it's supposed to be, that we bring that up right away. So that's a long-winded answer of saying it's just communication more than anything else. That's the number one way to build a good relationship. And that's not even in the professional field. I would just argue that as a general rule.
For sure. And following up on just talking a bit more about these projects, someone had asked, what is the best way to deal with multiple projects? So what is the level of priority that you usually assign to a project if this is the case?
Yeah, good question. Well, we're all data people. We love our matrices. So I like creating and evaluating against two different axes. The first one is feasibility, and the second one is impact. So if there is a project that you've identified is quite feasible and has a high level of impact, so that would be in the upper right quadrant for me, if you're seeing my mirror right here, then that's the one that I would start with first. And then based on that, you can see, okay, maybe there's a project somebody threw in there, but it's actually really difficult to get the data and it's not going to move the needle for us that much. Maybe that would drop to a lower priority. So it's really dependent on the objectives that your organization has, as well as the resources that you have, and then what the timing sense is. Because even for a project that's maybe less feasible right now, but has a high level of impact, maybe there are some tasks that you can start doing now to prepare and to improve the feasibility of that project. So if it's data collection, maybe there's something you can run in the background just to start collecting data for a project that right now isn't feasible, but might be in 3 months when you have more data.
Definitely. I see in the chat, Paul, as well, you were weighing in on this and you have some
Awesome.
feedback on what you use. Feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, when I started my new role, and I did like a couple weeks of meeting with various people and tried to find a way to rank projects, and we sort of landed on this, sort of what you're saying. One, how hard is it? Two, what's the impact? And then three, is the business ready for this or not? Which is sort of related to impact, but not quite. So and we sort of developed an internal, weighted number, and then scaled it from 0 to 100 to figure out what to do first.
Using data just to determine those projects. I love it. That's great. I like business readiness a lot. I think that's important. We get a lot of clients who ask us to do neural networks off the bat. And I'm like, well, let's talk about the data that you have, and then we'll see how it goes from there. Executives like to throw around terms that they're seeing without necessarily understanding the implications behind it. So it's one of the, again, this goes back to building trust. One of the biggest pieces and biggest responsibilities that we have is to educate whoever we're speaking with to make sure they understand what they're actually asking for. Because a lot of time what clients are asking us to do versus what they actually need can be different. So that's why we like to dig in there to make sure that we're addressing what the actual need is.
I see there's quite a few other anonymous questions that were asked earlier. And one was, how do you go about from building to serving a predictive model for your projects?
Yep. So in terms of building the model, we have a framework that we use and we also teach. And it has 6 steps. I'm sure that there are variations of this all over the place, but we always start with asking the question. So like I mentioned earlier, without the right question, it is very difficult to build a model that will make an impact. So you want to ask the right question. You want to make sure that you have the right data. Honestly, that will take 70 to 80% of any data project time, because collecting data and cleaning data can be very labor intensive. And that also goes back to the piece of setting up the appropriate data infrastructure and having the right data governance in place. Because if you do have both of those pieces, it dramatically shortens the amount of time that your data scientists need to spend in R or Python, just wrangling the data, manually understanding it. Once you have that, depending on what the objective is, you'll determine which algorithm makes the most sense. So if you're just starting out with unlabeled data and trying to understand different types of groups that your data falls into, you might want to do something like clustering, which is a well-known unsupervised machine learning algorithm. If you already have data that has existed and you're trying to predict trends or categories, you might do something like classification, maybe with a random forest or something like that. And use a part of your training data for that to build the model. And of course, you always want to test it, and then you want to validate it with real world data. And then the last piece of it is interpreting the results. So you might take a look at the data and you might say, okay, based on the set of recommendations that this algorithm is giving me, I want to create 3 different targeted marketing campaigns going on at different timeframes. Or if I'm a financial institution, maybe I want to understand who is the best type of person to loan to and to underwrite. And then how do I identify those people? So a lot of times that's the typical framework. And there's a lot of back and forth. So it sounds linear right now, but during the actual process, you should be prepared to go back and try different algorithms. A lot of times people like to build several different models to determine which one presents the most accuracy. You'll also want to take into account, what does accuracy mean to you? So just to give you an example, if you're building an algorithm for the Air Force to determine how often planes need to come in for maintenance, you really want to err on the side of caution for that, right? If you wait too long and planes start falling out of the sky, it's going to be a really big problem. So your accuracy level, you might need to adjust your parameters to be as conservative as possible. So a lot of that also depends on inputs that you can give your data science team to make sure that you're prioritizing the appropriate business cases.
As you say that, I hear a plane really loud going over my house right now. Going back to the training piece, do you know if students continue to use the skills, specifically coding skills, after training has ended? Do you have any tips to keep students engaged?
That's a good question. And that's one that we're working on internally right now, because one of the big trends that we're seeing is not just teaching individuals, but then also building this data culture and culture of data literacy to foster innovation and collaboration. We have seen incidences of people using our skills afterwards. I'll be honest with you, it's an area that we are looking to grow internally. So maybe deliver some assessments and surveys 6 months to a year out from a particular training program to see how they're using those skills. We're in the process of doing that now with 1 or 2 of our clients. We have seen evidence of it. So for example, with the programs that we run at HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, what we've seen is that groups from the cohorts that we've run continue to meet on a monthly basis, even after our program is over. So what does that lead to? It leads to an exchange of ideas, problem solving together, and just again, helps build that collaboration that ripples out and has a much bigger impact otherwise. We've seen other folks who have taken the skills that they've learned in our programs and then applied that to some proofs of concepts that have won awards for their organizations, won projects and things like that. So we do see evidence of it. But as a data-driven person, it's probably not up to the standard that I'd like that to be. And again, that's something that we're working on with our company.
Rick, I see you had a question about how Merav has scaled up the business. Do you
Hi.
want to have some context?
Hi,
Yeah,
Rick.
sure. Hi, really nice talk, really interesting topic, and I'm really happy I joined today because it's something that I was always kind of interested in, because I do a lot of training with a lot of academic groups and also for younger researchers and people coming into the field. And I've done some work with companies, and I'm always interested to hear how other people scaled up their business, and always interested to know, like, if they bootstrapped, if they got investors, how they standardized procedures, how they kind of met standards for instructional design and things like that. So when you introduced a topic and talked about you have all these internal people and instructional designers and data scientists, I was like, wow, like how did you got to that level, and how did you grow from your background and build up to this level?
Great question. It was a messy process. I'll just put it that way. You know, for us, we bootstrapped, so we didn't raise any capital. We decided that we wanted to retain control of our company and where it would go. For us, it was really important to do that. So because of that, we needed to ensure that we could keep the lights on, you know, from day one. We started out relying on individuals like data scientists to build the content for us, because I actually didn't have a background in data science. Obviously, I was coming in from education. So I was relying on the expert to build it up for me. And what we found is that there was a really big variety of quality in that content. And that just because somebody knows a topic, it's one thing to know it, and it's obviously a very different thing to teach it and to understand where a student is coming from. So even though it's much easier, frankly, to rely on one person to build content and deliver it, and that's how a lot of companies do it today, we decided that that wasn't the direction that we wanted to go in, because quality is really important. And, you know, my background in education makes it, you know, the number one priority. We want to deliver something good. So we developed a process in-house that goes through several iterations between our data scientists and our instructional designers, so that we get the best of breed from a technical standpoint, and then also best of breed from an instructional design standpoint. And it took us a few years to get to that point. You know, now that we have a lot of content, it's usually a faster process, but because we customize to almost all of our clients, so we incorporate their data, their use cases, we still go through that process. Not to mention the fact that, as we all know, technology is a double-edged sword. It's great, but it updates every 3 months. So we just need to make sure that nothing is deprecated, that when we're teaching it. So we've developed this process. And actually, one thing that we've worked on internally, which I'm really excited about when we're talking about scaling, is that our data science team actually developed an internal software that will automatically customize content for us. So instead of us having to run through that customization, we can actually take a data set, input it into this software with a shell of our course. And what it will do is actually run that data set and populate it, and not only populate it with the algorithms and the data that we're running, but it will also pull relevant case studies from Google using key search words. So we built a custom search algorithm for that as well. So it's one of the beauties of running a tech company, is we get a lot of folks who are very innovative, very motivated, and that will help us really fast track our scalability, because now the amount of time that it will take to build this type of customized content, which is a central point of our value, will be much more condensed. So I'm really excited about that development, and we're beta testing it now. We're slated to start using it more thoroughly later this year and into next year.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. The underlying thing here, by the way, is also just hire really good people and trust them to do the right thing. That's just the number one. If, you know, we have an absolutely amazing team, and a lot of the innovations that have come from our company come from them. And my job is to make sure that we have, you know, enough business coming in, and that we create a really good work environment for people, so that we have a, you know, a good culture and good retention rate.
Definitely. Libby, I see you asked a really good question around change management. Can I pass the mic over to you for that? I can also read.
Hey,
well.
sure,
Oh,
yes. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I was wondering if you cover any change management topics more broadly with your clients to help them implement the new skill sets that their teams are learning on a more organizational level, because I know that that can be a challenge. Like, learning the skill set is one thing, having the whole organization adopt that sort of shift in using that is a different story. So curious how you implement that, or if you even touch on it.
Yeah, absolutely, Libby. Great question. We do touch on that, because we saw exactly what you were talking about, where, you know, the joke that I like to make is, if a data scientist has an insight but nobody around her understands, it doesn't matter, right? So no is the answer to that question. It's a lame joke, but sometimes people laugh at it. And it speaks to an underlying current of truth, where at the end of the day, if your executives and your leadership are not on board with what you're doing, it's very difficult to implement the type of change that you need in order to see that massive return on investment of your data. So we do a lot of work with executives. We deliver a lot of workshops with them, as well as with managers. Managers tend to be a little bit more hesitant, because a lot of times people in higher levels feel as though they're being told that what they've been doing is wrong. And our first point is to make sure to let them know that that's absolutely not the case. Obviously, they've been successful to get to this point. And what we're here to do is give them a whole other skill set, and, you know, a satchel of tools that they'll be able to pull out and use to just increase the impact that they have. So we do a lot of work with change management and get the leadership on board, so that they can actually start to develop a data strategy around an organization.
Thank you. Mubanga, I see you also asked a question earlier around unsupervised learning and supervised learning. Would you want to add some extra context there?
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I would like to add a bit of context to the question. I'm actually busy with a master's degree in big data analytics, and the modules only covered supervised and unsupervised learning. And it was the usual cases where you look at credit card fraud, where you apply a logic regression or SVM, and some other cases where you apply unsupervised learning for clustering or principal component analysis. But what really intrigued me was the realm of reinforcement learning and how we can use it to understand or develop new things like robotics or landing the lunar rover. So I just wanted to understand, like in the mainstream day-to-day job, are there any specific projects that are reinforcement learning driven? Because the research I'm doing right now is to try to bring that aspect of machine learning into a day-to-day job, like in optimization of the radio environment, like how you can make that democratize it, basically. But I just want to understand, like in day-to-day, are most of the problems just simply solved using supervised and unsupervised and maybe semi-supervised, or do we have that niche where we have reinforcement learning as well?
It's a great question. So what I would say is the majority of cases that we see and that we teach are foundational, unsupervised and supervised machine learning. So typically we'll look at clustering, we'll do some classification techniques. Text mining is usually where people top out. And text mining is actually one of our areas of expertise, and it's incredibly, it's grown in popularity a lot, especially over the past few years because of the explosion of text data that comes through social media as well as customer comments. Reinforcement learning is really interesting that you mentioned that, because we actually were on a call this morning with one of our clients who was asking for a specific case for reinforcement learning. So we'll be building out that program for them. It's less common because it is a lot more complex. So we haven't seen a lot of demand for it to date. And I would argue, based on what I've seen, a lot of the challenges that people face today, it's less about building those types of predictive algorithms and more about even understanding the data that they have currently to make better decisions. It's getting from that 0 to 1 that we've seen is most difficult and most in demand. And then beyond that, usually you have people who are experienced enough who can develop those algorithms without as much support. So that's a really good question. We are seeing requests for reinforcement learning come up a little bit more now into the mainstream, but it's not quite as popular as our intro to programming courses.
Thank you, Merav. Arafat, I see that you've asked a question as well, just in the chat now. Would you want to ask that one live? Oh, sorry, there's a star there. The question is, did you have to help any stakeholder overcome fear of AI, even for simple models, for example, Logit? I might be getting that wrong. And if so, how did you approach them?
Yes, is the short answer to your question. A lot of what we do today is help alleviate trepidation about using data, because especially now, organizations that are not data driven feel like they're so behind, there's no way to catch up. Whereas in fact, I would still argue most organizations are still at that beginning stage. You know, the key thing is to just have a level of reassurance, as well as appropriate terminologies to deal with the fears that people have. So coming in and starting with, hey, what level are you at? And then letting them know, you know, if you're talking to your team about this as well, you can just say, hey, actually, this is true across our industry, right? Most of our organizations in this industry do not actually have this in place. So helping provide some of that level, that this problem is not unique, we've seen it before, and there is a pathway forward, is really critical to help people feel more at ease with the idea of learning data. The other piece of the puzzle is just giving them some a basic framework of what data science is. And the way that I like to describe it is that you are quantifying the relationships around you. That's what data science is. And we're able to do that now on a much higher level because we have this massive influx of data that we've never been able to collect before. So, you know, we look at data science as the intersection between three things: math, programming, as well as industry knowledge. And the most important piece is industry knowledge, because at the end of the day, you're the ones that know where the bodies are buried, where the biggest challenges are. And if we can build on top of that and give you a little bit of that programming skill, a little bit of that math background, you can actually leverage that much greater than somebody who's unfamiliar with your industry coming in with data science skills. So we like to set that tone. I have, I have a 1 hour presentation I do for Lunch and Learns. It's free. I just like doing this information that goes over the basic and foundational terminology of data science. We talk about what is data science, big data, supervised and unsupervised machine learning. And just by giving them that baseline of information, they're already starting to feel more comfortable. Because it's really intimidating. As somebody who learned data science when I started this company, like, it is very intimidating. And so it's really important to just understand that it's not magic. It's a step-by-step process. And by learning the terminology and the foundations, people actually start to feel more comfortable with that idea. So then we just roll the ball forward from there.
Definitely. Thank you. It's actually just making me think of a Saturday Night Live skit I was just watching about, like, explaining what an algorithm is to people that don't understand.
Now I need to see that. Was that a recent one?
I think it was. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's what I'm going to be Googling after this meeting then.
There's a question on how are the resources for a project chosen? Is the decision taken upon years of experience?
Resources. Can you read the question one more time?
So it's how are the resources for a project chosen? And I think the question is maybe, like, is it based on years of experience or like certain industry experience, or what goes into that?
That's a good question. There are two different factors. So there's resources in terms of people, and then there's resources in terms of technology. I would say people trumps technology every time, because most tools that you see in today's environment essentially solve the same thing. Like, if you take a look, a classic example would be Power BI versus Tableau. They both build interactive dashboards. They both connect with a variety of Microsoft tools like Excel and things like that. Power BI is way cheaper, but typically more people have Tableau. If you're a Tableau shop, I wouldn't recommend a solution to a problem buying Tableau, buying Power BI licenses, right? Use the technology that you have. It's much more important to have people that understand the project. I think somebody with industry experience is a good person to lead, and then having a few folks that can wrangle data, build dashboards, create that foundation with 1 or 2 data scientists. Again, it really depends on the project, the length of it, the amount of data that it has. You want to take a look and map out the requirements first, is what I would say. So how much data do you have? Think about how much time it will take and double it. And that's usually closer to the actual estimate of the amount of time that it takes. Make sure that you understand what resources are available to you. So what I like to do, and what we do in some of our executive level workshops, is actually help people brainstorm, what tools do you have in your organization today? And there's a lot of different answers, even within one organization, because everybody buys these one-off licenses. So it's important to get a good understanding of the tools that you have. And based on that roadmap, that's where you would kick it off. And doing things in like an agile method, if you're doing it in 2-week sprints, helps you take into account if you adequately prepared the resources or if you need more. The one thing that I like to say about any project, any program, is that everything is iterative, right? At the end of the day, the thesis you might have to start out with a project might not be the one that you end up with. So it's really important to stay flexible and to make sure that you're evaluating your progress and determining, hey, is this actually going down the path that we needed to, or did we discover something new that we now need to take into account, and go back a few steps and retry some things. So as long as you have that level of flexibility, everything else kind of falls into place.
Thank you. And I think I maybe heard this on like a prior podcast that you're maybe on, but around the BI tool conversation, that it's not an either or situation, but more of a combination. And curious how you would advise us to have those conversations internally.
Step one is asking what tools you have, because more likely than not, what we've seen is organizations have a lot of tools that they just never use. I've literally seen millions of dollars wasted on licenses that 5 people in an organization use. So if you're looking at a way to cut budget, take a look at that first. And then, you know, based on that, if you have tools that are working well for the organization, keep them. You know, I think most of the, if you look at the data analytics tools that you see today, most of them do the same thing, if we're being honest here. And that's why I love R and Python, because they're open source tools that, you know, you can use to build a lot of the same stuff. The interface is a little bit different. But with R, I love using R for prototyping. It's very easy to do, and especially incorporating R Shiny, where we can even build interactive dashboards that are similar to Tableau and Power BI without necessarily paying those licenses. So, you know, it's, what I would say is it really depends on the tools that you have, and if they cover most of what you want to do, just stick with them. There's no need to constantly go out and buy new tools. And that's also why our general staff training and our executive level trainings, we like to think that they're very important, because when somebody sees something new, they want to get it because I think it's a lot better. But giving them a base level of understanding of how to approach data and the questions that they need to ask will help them be more discerning when it comes to making these types of purchases in the future.
That's great feedback. I know we're getting to the top of the hour here, so if in case some people have to jump, and if it's okay to go over a few minutes, I'm just wondering, what's the best way to get in contact with you if people had follow-up questions? Is it LinkedIn?
So LinkedIn is great. What I'll also do is I'll give you my email. Send this to everyone. So it's just my first name. We decided my last name was too difficult, so it's just first name at datasociety.com. If you have any additional questions, just feel free to reach out to me there. I'm usually pretty responsive, although I will be out of the office on Monday and Tuesday. Vacation is important, folks. Make sure to take it. But I will, you know, happy to set up a time to chat further if you have any other questions about what I do, what my company does. I also love just helping people brainstorm about these types of projects and objectives. For me, sharing knowledge is a core part of who we are as a company. So I'm happy to pass along any information, best practices that we have about implementing the types of programs that I've talked about, or even the types of projects that we've run.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Merav. If it's okay, we do have a few more questions. Do you have to jump to another?
Sure. Let me just look at my calendar here.
No worries if you have to.
I have a few minutes. I'll just email people. It's a mostly internal meeting. I'll just email them and let them know I'm running a few minutes late. We can cut that part out of the recording in case anybody asks me about it later.
Sorry, we don't want to steal you.
This is fun for me. So this is something I could do all day, although I know other people have to run too. All right.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead.
I see there's one other question that came in from Arfath. Did you ever find yourself in a position where both causality and predictive performance were asked for, but not having the scope to run any causal experimentation? If so, how do you deal with such requests?
That just reminds me of one project we did earlier, a couple of years ago, with an association that sent out a lot of marketing campaigns. Was it like an association for associations? So just, you know, tens of thousands of emails every day sent, and they wanted to understand what the most important factors were in terms of the open rate. So they gave us a very, very large amount of data. We started going through it, and what we realized is almost all of their emails were sent on Tuesday mornings. So how are we supposed to understand if that's the best time to send it if we don't have anything else to compare it to? And that was a conversation we had to have with our client and just say, hey, we took a look at this data, here's what's going on, and we can't make any other predictions about that until you start to collect more data. So what we recommend is start to send newsletters at different times on different days. And then after a few months, we can come back and we can actually evaluate which factors are most important. So out of that story, what I would say is just make sure if you are collecting data or if you're trying to do some A/B testing, actually do the B and not just the A, because you need to have those types of comparisons there to make sure that your data is robust enough to do that type of analysis.
I love that. One other question was, how do you host your Shiny apps?
How do we host it? I think we just do it on shinyapps.io, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since we've built them. Sometimes we use an iframe and we post it also internally on our website, depending on what the tool is. So we actually built a Shiny Apps dashboard. I don't know if it's still running, for the White House about 5 years ago. We participated in the Opportunity Project, which I'm not sure if you're all aware of, but it's a great initiative that pairs industry folks with agency people to solve a particular challenge. So at that time, we worked with the Department of Education. We built out a dashboard that mapped school resources in the city of Philadelphia to help people understand both what resources were close to schools. They could also compare different schools within a county and help determine, if there's no library within a mile of a school, is that a place to put a library or a grocery store, because food deserts are also a really big issue. So Shiny dashboards are great. I think we hosted it on shinyapps.io, if I remember correctly.
That's great. And do they run that every year?
They do run it every year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to check out that link. I just want to double check with everyone. Are there certain questions that I maybe have missed? I'm trying to do my best to scroll through, but feel free to speak up live too.
Got a very short one. We talked a lot about explaining algorithms to business users and business users having an aversion to using that output and learning more about that. But it made me think it's very easy for me to say, like, oh yeah, come on, like it's just multivariate regression. Like you shouldn't be scared of it. I'm trying to think on the flip side of that, are there people or groups that come to me and say like, hey, this is the direction we should go, right? You should be on board. And I'm like, I don't feel great about that. So I do first person there, but I'm curious, is there anything that comes to your mind from that perspective that you are averse to?
That's a good question. Also, a lot of good questions today. I don't know if so far we haven't been asked to do anything that like I think is ethically questionable. I'll just put it that way. Although I know that happens a lot. And of course, there's a lot of discussion now with everything that's happening in Facebook. What I will say is I'll just add on, Frank, to what you were saying, which is I did put a lot of responsibility on business people. What I didn't mention is that sometimes it's really difficult for data scientists to communicate just effectively in general. So the flip side to that is making sure that your data scientists can understand the business enough to be able to connect with other business users. There is actually, I can't remember the name of it. There was a book that was recommended to me recently that was about communication for technical people to speak business. And I'm blanking on the name right now, but it has a big yellow cover on it. I'll see if I can find it. And so what I would recommend is on the flip side as well, just making sure that your data scientists feel comfortable speaking to some business use cases will also help facilitate that. I think it is a two-way street, although we usually find one more than the other.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Merav. Can I ask you one last question?
Absolutely.
For people on the call who are hoping to get into a data science leadership role or maybe start their own company like you, what advice would you give them?
If you're going to start a company, make sure you're financially stable and just let your friends and family know you won't see them for a few years. That's my first piece. It is very time consuming. It's incredibly rewarding. It takes a lot of time. You have to really love solving challenges and figuring ways out in situations, especially if you're bootstrapped like we are. Obviously, if you are funded by investors, there's a different set of challenges there. If you're looking to become more in that data leadership role, I would say communication, just as we've talked about before, is incredibly important. So make sure that you feel comfortable communicating the importance of data, and that you can also demonstrate that as well. So in your presentation, start to bring in data-driven results and research, and really define yourself as the data person. Just put yourself in that role, because that's what we've seen happen a lot with people who are, self-made data scientists and things like that. They just want to solve a challenge, they get more involved in it, and that's how they grow their skills. So I would recommend, if you want to spearhead those types of lunch and learns, do it, right? There's not a ton that's stopping us from creating these types of informal sessions, and just keep at it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but the end is really rewarding when you get to see challenges like helping people identify where the opioid crisis is most critical, or where some of those prescriptions are coming from, so that we can help nip it in the bud. Helping predict outbreaks of COVID in nursing homes, right? All of these critical things that are impacting our day-to-day lives. Getting goosebumps talking about it now, because it's just really rewarding to see that type of an impact that we can have, and that all of you can have too.
Thank you so much, Merav. I really appreciate you jumping on and chatting with all of us. That was awesome. Really appreciate your insights too.
My pleasure. Really good questions. I appreciate everybody being so interactive. It makes my life a lot easier and more fun too to do this type of thing. So I'm really glad you all were able to come today. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm sure there's only one Merav Yuravlivker on there. You can find me pretty easily. Or feel free to send me any additional notes, emails, if you want to chat about anything, just merav@datasociety.com. And really best of luck on your data journeys. I hope this was helpful and informative to you.
Thank you all for joining as well. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll put the recording up on YouTube too, so I can put the link to Data Society there as well. But thank you so much, Merav. Have a great rest of the day.